back at the beginning of the semester, we focused on the basics of bibliography and citation. And now I'd like to get into some particularly difficult aspects of working with Japanese language resources, as opposed to just English language resources, which is what we looked at already. And as a full disclaimer, I'll say that the information that I'm providing here for you is a mashup of stuff from the Chicago Manual of Style, from an old edition, the 1993 edition, from Webb's Research in Japanese Sources, which is your textbook, and that dates to 1965. The style sheet for the Far Eastern Quarterly, which dates to February 1956, and the Sweat Guide, which is much more recent. So as time has progressed, some of these rules have morphed in one direction or another. And so what you'll have to do is use all of these sources to come up with sort of a final methodology for citation. And I'm going to try and distill all that for you here today in the simplest way that I can. So I'm going to start with citation, and then later on we're going to move on to style. You might think that citation is citation, we already did it, big deal. Why are Japanese resources so different? Well, to begin with, they're in Japanese, and we've already looked at issues revolving around romanization, but we're going to see some other related things too. The information that publishers choose to include in published Japanese resources is not always the same as what Western publishers choose to include. So you have to sift through the information in a consistent way. The following slides will explain some of the main points of which you should be aware. I'm not going to try and cover everything, but if you read Webb, for example, very closely, you'll get a lot more detail. All right, let's get started. Generally speaking, and we already covered this at the beginning of the semester, when you're writing a bibliography or a citation, you'll need 5 ingredients. The author, the title, the place of publication, the publisher, and the date. Okay, that's the lowest common denominator. There could be lots of variations, but that's the lowest common denominator. Where do you find that information? Well, if you're working with a printed book, you'll find that information in something called a colophon, and a lot of people have never heard that word before, so there's a new vocabulary word for you. The colophon is that page, usually on the opposite side of a title page in an English work, that gives much of that particular information. So I just said in books published in the United States and in Great Britain, usually place all that information, place the colophon at the beginning of the work, and it's usually on the opposite side of the title page. Not always, but usually. What about works in Japanese? Well, they're a little bit different. This is an example of an English language colophon, kind of randomly chosen from my bookshelf. We get all kinds of information there. We get the author, the copyright date, information about Library of Congress, cataloging. This is sort of a standard colophon. I should say that this is a fairly recent one. It's from 2006. And you're probably going to be working largely with more recent materials. But if you go further back, let's say you go back 100 years or so, even if you're working with an English language resource, you'll find much less information. So as we have gone forward in time, it's become standard on the part of publishers to provide more information. So what about Japanese colophons in Japanese language publications? That information that you need for your bibliography appears either immediately following the title page, which we just saw in the case of an English sample, but much more commonly, that information comes on the last page of the book. Okay. Keep in mind that Japanese books can run either left to right or right to left. Actually, more often than not, they run right to left in sort of the opposite direction that you would expect if you're used to reading English language resources. So how can you figure out who the author is? You might think it's really straightforward, but it isn't necessarily. Be sure, when you're looking at a Japanese resource, to actually identify the author of the work correctly. A lot of the books published in East Asia are parts of series, and therefore they include the names of series editors instead of authors. Okay, how can you tell the difference? Well, you're looking for particular kanji. So if you see this kanji here, or put together with this one in a combination, that indicates that that's the author of the work. This kanji indicates that that person is an editor. And you should only include the editor's name if there is no individual author listed, but the editor is designated. Or if you're citing an article from an edited volume, in which case there's going to be multiple articles there and you're going to include both the author's name and the editor's name. I should also say that after I go through some of these slides, I'm going to show you a solid example of a colophon from a Japanese resource so that we can kind of review how this all looks. So who is the author is the next question, or sorry, a continuation of that question. Books published in Japan usually list an individual publisher, and that person's name will often be followed by these kanji, okay? Ignore that person's name. Don't include that person in your citation. That's not the author. That is the publisher. And, you know, sometimes that information is included in an English language colophon also, but I think more commonly we see it in Japanese colophon. How about the place of publication? Although it's becoming more common to include the city of publication as a prominent element of the publication page, usually it's right below the title, often the city must be ascertained from the address given for the publisher in the colophon. So it's not going to say, you know, Nihon no Dekishi and then at the bottom Tokyo. Okay. Instead, you have to go to the colophon to find that information. In general, you should make every effort to discover the city name. Avoid simply using the name of a province. In the case of somewhere outside of Japan, if you're using other East Asian resources, or a prefecture. Some publishers are super important, big names, and they're so well known that you don't have to think too much about it. So, for example, if you see Shogakukan as one of the publishers of one of your works, you know right away that this is located in Tokyo. Everybody knows that. You still have to include it in your bibliography, but everybody knows that that's where Shogakukan is located. Most of the huge publishing houses in Japan are located in Tokyo. So, following that statement, it should come as no surprise that if the place of publication is not noted, and that happens more often than you might think, the assumption is that the place of publication is Tokyo, particularly if you're working with a slightly older resource. It might not have the mailing address, the postal address in the colophon of the publisher. So if you're looking around the colophon and you just don't see anything there that indicates where it was published, then you assume that it is Tokyo, and indeed you write Tokyo in your citation, in your bibliographic entry. It's important to pay careful attention to the terminology in the colophon. Sorry for that typo there. CJK publications often distinguish between the publishing company, the shubansha, the issuing person, the hakkosha, and the printer, the insatsha. You should only be listing the publishing company. We don't care who printed it. We don't care who issued it. We're only concerned about the publishing company. So again, you're looking for these kanji, okay? We already covered these. We don't want to do issuing. And insatsu means to print, the physical process of printing. So we don't care about who printed it either. That's not important information for a citation. What about dates? Japanese colophons usually include the month of publication, and actually, these days, they often include the day that the thing was published. But in Western language citation, we drop the date, we drop the month and the day, and only include the year. the year is sufficient. I know you might be thinking, oh, but I've got it. Why not include that information? Because as a standard practice in style of Western citation, we don't include that information. You should be aware that Japanese books often include information about subsequent reprintings. This is something that Webb goes into great detail about, and he tries to draw a rule of thumb about it. Unfortunately, I think that has largely changed in more recent years. Publication dates are indicated by the term shuppan here, or shohan. Okay, shuppan, publication, we already did that. Shohan means the first edition. Okay, because this kanji is hajime, right? The first. Reprintings are then labeled with the terms insatsu or inko. So when you're citing that work, you should include only the year of publication and not subsequent printings. Now, Webb contradicts me in that. Webb says that you should use the most recent year because that's when that particular resource that you have in your hand was actually published. But in most cases, reprinting doesn't mean a new edition per se, and there's really no difference between one or the other. So more common practice that I've seen recently is to use the year of publication, the actual year of publication, not any reprinting dates. Publishers in Japan note the date using the Japanese calendar. Yes, they still do that. Sometimes they'll give you the Western calendar year, but all the time they'll give you the Japanese calendar year. Assuming that you'll not be using works published prior to the Meiji Restoration, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on this today, and then when we get later into the lunar calendar, we'll be talking a lot more about calendrical conversion. But here are the years that you need to know. The Meiji period is 1868 to 1912, the Taisho period 1912 to 1926, the Showa period 1926 to 1989, and the Heisei period 1989 until the present. Okay? It's way too easy to do the math incorrectly, and boy, I speak from experience. Many handy charts are available online. There's a link here to one. Frankly, I print one. I have one printed out, and I just have it taped to my wall next to my desk. So if I ever see a Japanese date and I need to make that conversion really quick to avoid making any sort of mathematical slip, I just glance over at my chart, and I would recommend that you do the same thing. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that these periods overlap. So the Meiji is until 1912, and then during that year, the emperor died, and we switched over to the new era, to the Taisho. So Taisho begins in 1912. So 1912 straddles two different periods in Japanese history. So 1912 can be either Meiji 45 or Taisho 1. So this shouldn't be too much of a problem for you, but let's say, hypothetically, that you're working with a bunch of different works. Two of them were both published in 1912, but you look at the colophon for one, and it says, oh, this was published in Meiji 45. And you look at the colophon for the other one, and it says it was published in Taisho 1. When you write the citation for both of those works, both of them will be labeled as having been published in 1912. Okay, so you can see how it might be a little bit harder going in the other direction. When in doubt, here's a really fast trick for figuring out information for a citation. Take advantage of the fact that OCLC, or WorldCat, as we've been referring to it, probably has that work that you've got in your hands in its database. Some librarian has already done the work for you. Some cataloger has already done the work for you. So if you have one or two pieces of citation information, say the publisher and the author's name, or three pieces, the publisher, the author's name, and the date of publication, think about that WorldCat search engine. You can usually plug in that fragmented information that you have and find and or confirm the rest. So let's say you have the publisher and the date, and you've got the author's name, but it's only in kanji and you're not really sure how it's supposed to be read. Well, you can type kanji into WorldCat and then search for that thing and see what comes up. You can also search WorldCat using the ISBN of a work, and that can be very specific and very successful. Japanese books nowadays, if they're published, do have an ISBN in them, but that's a relatively new development. If you're using something that was published, say, 20, 30 years ago, the chances of finding an ISBN there are much smaller. Of course, Webb doesn't mention anything about using WorldCat because WorldCat didn't exist when Webb wrote his book. All right, let's do a practical application of all those rules. What do we do with this? How do we actually write the citation? We know what we need for it. We have some pointers about how to find it, but how do we actually put this down on the page? Well, you need to put your footnotes and your bibliography in a standard format. And as we discussed at the beginning of the semester, MLA and Chicago style are the two most common. As I said before, really usually default to the Chicago style, so that's what I'm going to be using in my demonstration. I don't really care if you prefer MLA over Chicago, as long, of course, as you are consistent. Our library here at the University of Albany has a simple handout available on these, plus there's lots of resources and links on the Blackboard website to different types of citation. If you didn't look at those at the beginning of the semester, you might want to go back and take another look at them. And of course, a style book, if you're willing to shell out a few bucks, is a great investment. So here's a colophon from a book sitting on my bookshelf. It's got most of the recent information. Wasn't published too long ago. It's a little bit squiggly as a scan, but I think we can work with it. What do we find here? Well, who do you think the author is? We're looking for some indication of authorship. Remember this character, that kanji? Aha! And then it's put together with this one. That means the author. In this case, we find the name here. Okay. Now, how to read that name is coming up in the unit we have on biography. So I'll just tell you what it is right now. It's Natsume Soseki. Now, you could probably do that too by inputting those kanji into just the internet, into a Google search, or into WorldCat, and it will come up with the romanization. Okay, that's the author. That's the first information. How about the title? The title is in this colophon and in most colophon, it's going to be on the far right-hand side when it's vertically written. And the title of this book is a little bit deceptive because you're looking at it and you think, oh, wait a minute, that's the name of the author. And it's true because this is a one-volume collection of works. And here this means collection. Shu means collection. This is a collection of works by Natsume Soseki. And so the title of the book is Natsume Soseki Shu. Okay? And then there's sort of a subtitle, if you will, or a series title, and that is here, Shincho Nihon Bungaku, and it's volume 3. That's the series. How do you know that's a series? Well, that's a little bit intuitive, I gotta be honest. There's no kanji there that tells you it's part of a series, but you got that volume number, so that helps you know. And if you do a lot of literature, you look at a title like that and immediately you understand, oh, that must be part of a series. Okay, so what's the next piece of information that we need? We need to find, now we have the author and we have the title. Now we need the place of publication. Well, this one actually has a postal address, and we're going to be saying more about postal addresses and what roles they have, how they appear later on when we do geography. But for right now, I'll show you. I'm circling it. Here is the postal address. Yubin Bango, the post zip code is 162. And here's the main address. Oh, it's Tokyo. Of course, I would have known that anyway because the publisher is so famous, but it tells you straightforward. This is Tokyo. So you're not going to see Tokyo anywhere else in this colophon except in that postal address. So you have to pay attention to the postal address. In English language colophon, they often will list the place of publication separately, and then in addition they may have the postal address. Okay, so that's the place of publication. There's a lot of superfluous information here. They give us the telephone number, of the publishing house. We don't need that. Who cares, right? And they gave us the issuing person here and the issuing place or the company here. Again, that's superfluous information. We don't need that. So now we're down to the publishing house. We need to know who the publisher was. How can we figure that out? And here I'll admit, I've been a little bit deceptive in choosing this colophon. I didn't make it really straightforward. If you're looking for those kanji, shuppan, that I indicated earlier, we're not going to find them here. Uh-oh, now what do we do, right? It's not over here. There's a lot of extra information over here, like what's the company that made the paper and all that kind of stuff, right? The cover. Here's the place of printing. We don't need that. This is the actual person who is responsible for putting the book physically together. So let's revisit what I had earlier labeled as superfluous information. The only publishing house that's listed here is Shinchosha, one of the biggest publishing houses in Japanese literature. And Shinchosha or Shincho as a name appears in the series title too. So although this one would be really tricky, and I wouldn't throw one of these curveballs at you as a homework assignment or as a test, I'll tell you that the publisher here is Shinchosha. Okay. Okay, and the last thing we need is the date of publication. The dates over here, they give us two dates. They give us the initial date, the Hakko, which was Showa 44. And then they give us the date of this particular printing, which was Heisei 3. So if you have a little handy chart and take a look at it, you'll see that Showa 44 was 1969. Incidentally, Heisei 3 was 1991, so this volume was reprinted in 1991. So how would this all look when we put it together? Here at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a bibliographic entry for this work, and I did this in the Chicago style. So we have Natsume Soseki, and don't forget that if there's a macron there, if it's a long vowel, you have to include that. And then after his name, there's no punctuation, but I do put in the kanji for his name. In a way, this is a relatively new stylistic flourish, because until fairly recently, as I mentioned in the word processing unit, it was very difficult to integrate Japanese characters with Roman letters in one text. But now that we can do it, and we can do it easily, I'm seeing more and more scholars do it, and it's tremendously helpful because Romanization is a poor representation of something that's much richer. Now, the case of Natsume Soseki is a very famous author, so there would be no confusion, but you might have a name of somebody who's relatively unknown, and it might be a really common name. In the way that in English, John Smith is a common name. There's plenty of common names in Japanese too, but having the kanji could really distinguish one person from the next. So, as a standard new rule of thumb, we include the kanji after the person's name. And then I've got a period. And then the title in romanization, I've romanized the title in italics, again with a macron, 2 macrons over the appropriate vowels. And then after that title, I have the characters for the title. Note that the characters here are not italicized. The English romanization is, but the characters, the kanji, are not. And then I note that this is in Shincho Nihon Bungaku Volume 3. At that point, I stop including the kanji. Sometimes people include the kanji for each one of those 5 elements, those 5 ingredients that you find in a bibliography, but more often you simply have the kanji for the name and for the title. And the reason for that is that people don't need the kanji for Tokyo. Everybody knows what those are. And usually the publisher is a pretty well-known organization, and so we don't really need the kanji for that either. But certainly in the case of the author's name and the title, confusion could easily arise, and that's why we include the kanji. Now, I want to take that and I want to delve a little bit deeper into the topic of style. We're just looking at citation in general, and now I want to look at specific style rules when you're citing something that's originally in Japanese. You'll note that many texts have in their front matter an explanation of their style rules, many journals in particular, and that's there to help the reader. So the author may tell you when you see um, italics, or when you see an asterisk, or you see something like that, it means X. Now, you don't have to write your own style rules. Certainly as an undergraduate, the longest paper you're probably ever going to produce is going to be maybe 20, maybe more pages, but it's not going to be a book length. So you don't have to write down your own style rules. But I would recommend that before you start writing a paper, you have some idea of what your own style rules are. Make a plan, in other words, and stick with it. Why? Because style rules will help you be consistent, and consistency is, of course, the golden rule. And I'll give you some specific examples of these sorts of style rules. You should decide, for example, which romanization system you're going to use. I'm going to use Hepburn, I'm going to use the Kunne Shiki, one or the other, right? But you don't want to switch midstream. You're going to stick with one or the other. So when you start writing the paper, you know, okay, I'm going to use Hepburn here, and 5 pages later you're still using Hepburn. Your reader never gets confused because it's always consistent. In addition to the rules that we learned about romanization, there are some other style matters to keep in mind for both your bibliography and for your prose, the actual part of the paper. So that extends beyond citation. Including entries in an annotated bibliography, which you're going to be producing at the end of this course as a final project. So let me start with italics. Generally speaking, books and periodical titles should be italicized. Article titles, however, will be put in quotation marks. In the bad old days of typewriters, instead of italics, we used underlining because it was easier. You could just move the carriage back and type back over with underlining. But today, in the world of computers, there's really no purpose, I think, to doing underlining. I prefer italics. Somehow, to me, it just looks better. You could do one or the other, but of course you want to be consistent. Don't underline some titles and italicize others. Japanese terms should be italicized except for those that have entered the English language. So for example, sake, kimono, geisha, generally speaking, you wouldn't italicize those because you can actually find those in English language dictionaries. But if it's a word that wouldn't appear in a standard English language dictionary, then you should probably italicize it. You have a number of choices you need to make about italics when you sit down to write a paper, and this again is part of that process of choosing a style. One of your choices might be to italicize each Japanese word every time it appears in your paper. Pretty straightforward. Or you might decide, I'm not going to italicize anything. I wouldn't recommend that personally. Or you might decide, I'm going to italicize a foreign word, a Japanese word, on the first appearance only, and then every subsequent time that it appears in my manuscript, I'm going to leave it in regular font. Any of these are okay, although I certainly would prefer the first or the third, as long as you are consistent. What about personal names? There's a bit of disagreement about this depending on who you're reading. Japanese names, I think this is the generally accepted approach. Japanese names should be given surname first, given name second, without a comma, unless the person publishes in English. So if you are citing a book by Taro Suzuki, Suzuki being a surname, and the book is written in English, it was written in English, it's not a translation, it was published in English, then you would treat his name as you would John Smith's name. So it'll be Suzuki Taro. But if this book is published in Japanese, then you present that name in the Japanese order. So Suzuki Taro, okay, without a comma. The comma indicates that that work originally was published by somebody, it was written by somebody in English. Western names should appear personal name first, surname second, except of course in a bibliography. maybe I should say a little bit more about that. So that first bullet point, I'm referring to both how the name would appear in a bibliography and how the name would appear in the body of a paper. And in the case of Western names, if you're putting that name in a bibliography, then of course there's a comma. If it is in the context of the paper, within the text of the paper, then it will be in the Western order. So let me use John Smith as an example again. So you're writing a paper and you want to say, John Smith said yesterday that it was going to rain. You wouldn't say Smith John said yesterday it was going to rain. You'd say John Smith. But if you were writing about Mr. Suzuki, you'd say Suzuki Taro said that tomorrow it would rain. You wouldn't say Taro Suzuki said tomorrow it would rain. What about titles? Generally speaking, titles are not translated. They're transliterated, they're Romanized, but they're not translated. There are some people who really want to do that and want to translate a title. If you decide you're going to do it, then you should be consistent, which means you're going to do one, you got to do them all, right? And the translation should appear in parentheses after the romanization of the title. So a bibliographic entry might appear something like this: Inose Naoki. In this case, by the way, Inose is the surname and Naoki is the given name or the personal name. And then the title, Mikado no Shouzo, and then the kanji, and then in parentheses, portrait of the Mikado. What about kanji? Well, just like italics, you've got some choices. You could provide kanji in every instance. Every time a Japanese word shows up in your paper, you write it in romanization and then you provide the kanji. One of the things that Webb points out, and I want to reiterate it, is that even though we can, and we do have the possibility now of putting Japanese text into an English document, and it's super easy, that does not absolve you as an author from providing the romanization of the word. Indeed, you are expected to include the romanization. You should expect your audience not to be able to read the kanji. That's the assumption. And so this is actually one of the things that is very difficult, more difficult for you as a student of Japanese studies than for a native Japanese speaker who's writing. So when you're writing in English about Japanese studies, you have to know the pronunciation of all the terms and all the names that you're going to mention, whereas a Japanese author might see a name that they are not sure about. They're not really sure how it's pronounced because names are so wacky. But that doesn't matter because all they have to do is reproduce the kanji and they can get away with it. So you got to really step up to the plate on that one. So you have a choice. You can provide kanji in every instance. You could provide kanji in the first instance and then subsequently not. Subsequently only provide the word in romanization, whatever that word may be. A third choice would be to provide a glossary of terms in romanization and kanji. And Webb mentions this also if you can't put the kanji into the main text. As recently as 10 years ago, there were plenty of publishers, publishing houses in North America who refused to input characters into the main body of a text. My second book is a good example of this. My second book had lots of Japanese terms in it, and the publisher said, no, you can't put those terms in. You're going to have to create a separate glossary that we're going to print using separate software. And so that was one more step that I had to make. This really applies only to longer papers in which you've got plenty of terms and plenty of names that you want to include. Okay, so that's our lesson on citing Japanese sources. And I'd like you to check out I want to quickly review the homework for this. This is on Blackboard, and I'm at the end of it here. I'm going to go to the top. This is the citation homework. So look at the direction. On the following pages are colophons from a variety of resources. Your job for your homework is to write a bibliography of those sources. It doesn't have to be annotated. I just want you to take the information that I'm giving you and put it into a bibliography. If you can't guess the reading of proper names, don't worry about it. Just provide the kanji. But actually, I think you should be able to do it in the cases that I've provided. Your final product, this is important, should be in alphabetical order and should also have hanging indents, which we discussed when we did word processing at the beginning of the semester. In some cases, I've provided a number of pages from the work because you need all of them in order to write a proper citation. And I have clearly indicated in each case which book or article or chapter should be cited. So for example, on page 2, there's a title page and a colophon for Japan, a traveler's literary companion. And on page 3, there's a table of contents. I'll show you those in just a minute. So you can assume that any unmarked pages preceding a marked page are all from the same work. So your final product will have 4 entries in it. Okay, let's look at the second page. This is the colophon. This is the title page on the left and the colophon on the right of this particular work. And this is the table of contents of that particular work. This is a collection of essays, and what I want you to cite is this particular essay. Okay? Here's a journal. This is the title page of the journal. And what I want you to cite is this particular article in the journal. So we've got a book chapter, we have an article. Here's a book. I want you to cite the book. As I said, your citation for the book should be to the book itself, not to any particular part, not a chapter, right? I just want you to cite the book. And the big challenge is the fourth one. Here's a work in Japanese. It has some furigana where you need it to be. And I think there's plenty of information for you to cite that. Again, I just want you to cite the book, not a particular part of it. Okay? And it might take a little bit of sleuthing on your part to figure out all the details. But that's what the homework is all about. Good luck with that.